2 U.S. Navy warships were deployed near Scarborough Shoal in the West Philippine Sea, a disputed waters in the South China Sea on Wednesday, just 2 days after a collision between 2 Chinese vessels while pursuing a Philippine Coast Guard ship in the area, according to the Philippines' top government officials. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Higgins, DDG-76, and the Independence-class littoral combat ship USS Cincinnati, LCS-20, conducted freedom of navigation and overflight patrols around the shoal. While PLA Navy vessel with hull number 568 was observed shadowing the U.S. ships, about 30 nautical miles, 55 kilometers, from the Scarborough Shoal. There were no reports of any untoward incident, based on the information from U.S. officials and a Philippine surveillance flight. The U.S. Navy has staged what it calls freedom of navigation voyages and overflights in the South China Sea for years, to challenge China's restrictions and its demand for entry notifications in virtually the entire stretch of the disputed waters that it claims. That has angered China, and its forces have had close runs-in with U.S. warships and aircraft on such patrols in international waters and airspace. Scarborough Shoal, one of the most hotly contested features in China's territorial dispute with the Philippines, sits within the U.S. Treaty Alley's exclusive economic zone. While China effectively seized control of waters around the atoll in 2012, the Philippines has since increased its patrols in the area to assert its claim and deliver supplies to local fishermen. The deployment happened after Washington's ambassador to Manila, Mary Kay Carlson, on Tuesday condemned the latest reckless action by China directed against a Philippine vessel in Scarborough. The rich fishing atoll off the northwestern Philippines has been the scene of increasingly tense confrontations between the Chinese and Philippine Coast Guard and other ships in recent years. The Philippines is the oldest treaty ally of the U.S. in Asia. Washington has repeatedly warned that it's obligated to defend the Philippines if Filipino forces come under an armed attack, including in the South China Sea. Clashes at Scarborough and other South China Sea flashpoints have raised questions over whether a miscalculation could trigger Manila's mutual defense treaty with Washington, and potentially a conflict between the two superpowers. If the Chinese destroyer had succeeded in ramming, and probably sinking the Philippine Coast Guard, instead of its companion, this would have been considered an overt act of war that could trigger U.S. involvement through their mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has said the death of a Filipino sailor in an incident of this type could be seen as an act of war. The PLA destroyer could have struck the much smaller Philippine Coast Guard ship instead. This would have almost certainly resulted in injury and death, even the sinking of the Philippine vessel. American officials have repeatedly pledged to defend the Philippines from any armed attack in the disputed waters, stressing Washington's ironclad commitment to the 1951 Defense Treaty. Chinese ships appeared to be trying to sandwich the Philippine Coast Guard ship between the PLA Navy and CCG ship, forcing it to take the water cannon blast, at close range, down into its engine intakes. And one of the Chinese ships was supposed to bump it, hit its stern or otherwise cripple it. Chinese vessels were trying a new, bold, and intricate maneuver against a clearly well-prepared Philippine crew, without either of those prerequisites succeed, and paid the price for its own aggressive actions. Yesterday, while the Philippine Coast Guard caravan was conducting its maritime domain awareness flight, it was intercepted by a Chinese fighter jet that flew as near as 500 feet laterally from the PCG aircraft. For 20 minutes, it conducted dangerous maneuvers with such distance, and even above the Coast Guard aircraft at an approximate height of 200 feet. A separate statement from China claimed it expelled USS Higgins after it intruded into its territorial waters surrounding Wangyan-dao, the name it calls for Bajo de Masinloc. The Navy of the PLA Southern Theater Command mobilized forces to monitor, issue warnings and expel the vessel in accordance with laws and regulations, Senior Captain He Tichung, a spokesperson for the Navy of the PLA's Southern Theater Command, said in a statement published by Chinese media Global Times. 4 CCG vessels with bow numbers 5303, 4202, 3502, and 5306 were also monitored by the PCG around Bajo de Masinloc. Terriella noted the absence of the damaged CCG 3104 and PLA Navy 164 within the vicinity of Bajo de Masinloc. On Monday, a Chinese Navy destroyer and a Chinese Coast Guard ship accidentally collided while trying to block and drive away a smaller Philippine Coast Guard ship, the BRP Suluan, about 10.5 nautical miles, 19 kilometers, from Scarborough. Video footages made public by the Philippine Coast Guard show the Chinese Coast Guard ship blasting its powerful water cannon and a number of Chinese personnel standing at the bow shortly before that section was hit by the fast-turning Chinese Navy ship. Shortly after the collision, the video shows the heavily shattered bow of the Chinese Coast Guard ship without the Chinese personnel, who were standing on deck before the crash. The Chinese Navy ship sustained deep dents and what appeared to be linear gushes on its hull. Following the collision of two Chinese ships in the South China Sea, tensions are expected to escalate between China and the Philippines, with potential implications for regional stability. The incident, which occurred near Scarborough Shoal, is likely to prompt both countries to reinforce their positions and potentially increase their presence in the disputed waters. The collision could also lead to further diplomatic protests and heightened scrutiny of China's actions in the region. It's unusual for a Chinese warship to interact directly with Philippine forces, and PLA Navy warship Guilin's actions are being viewed by analysts as an escalation. It remains to be seen whether the incident marks the beginning of heavier plan involvement in the dispute or whether China will escalate further. The Philippines is expected to continue challenging Chinese maritime incursions into its exclusive economic zone, with President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. reiterating last week his pledge not to yield, even for 1 square inch of Philippine-claimed waters. The collision highlights the risk of accidents and miscalculations in the South China Sea, where multiple countries have overlapped claims and a significant military presence. Meanwhile, the situation continues to escalate, with the Philippines lodging a formal diplomatic protest with China, and the U.S. sending a couple of their naval ships to the area as a show of support, which the Chinese are now hilariously claiming to have expelled U.S. ship from the area. The incident is likely to draw further international attention to the South China Sea dispute, with countries like Australia also expressing concern over China's actions. The U.S., a key ally of the Philippines, has already deployed warships to the area as a show of support and to monitor the situation. This could lead to further U.S. involvement in the dispute and increase the potential for direct conflict between U.S. and Chinese forces. U.S. interests in the South China Sea include freedom of navigation, unimpeded passage for commercial shipping, and peaceful resolution of territorial disputes according to international law. Failure to respond to Chinese coercion or use of force could damage U.S. credibility, not only in Southeast Asia, but also in Japan, where anxiety about intensified activity by Chinese military and paramilitary forces is growing. Conflict in the South China Sea would put at risk the more than $5 trillion in trade that passes through those strategic waters annually. China is likely to defend its actions, claiming its actions were necessary to protect its territorial claims, even though the area is within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone.